or Chamisa. Now, at the just concluded Heads of State Summit in Mauritania, leaders were urged to escalate the war on graft from words to action in Africa. Now, but in a battle that dragged on for decades, the question is, are the continent leaders committed to winning the fight against corruption? That is the million-dollar question. And now let me take you straight to some of the Corruption Perception Index 2017 that was prepared by the Transparency International. There you go. You can see most of the African countries there dismally ranked, right from Kenya at 143, Mauritania, Nigeria, the most populous country there has been ranked at number 148. Then Uganda, Cameroon. This is just some of the countries there that have been ranked in that corruption perception index. Now, let me take you straight to our discussion tonight. Once again, I have Samuel Kimeu, who's the Executive Director, Transparency International Kenya with me in studio, as well as Professor Alfred Omenya, who's a policy analyst, and Dr. Boniface Mwoka, who's a governance expert. He is at our CBD studios right here in Nairobi. Good evening, gentlemen, and welcome to the program. So, Mr. Kimeu, let me begin with you. We've seen that Corruption Perception Index 2017. We're going to talk about that shortly. But yesterday was a day set aside by the African Union to mark Africa's Anti-Corruption Day. Apparently, it's going to be marked every July 11th, every year from now on. And we've seen that letter by the Transparency International to the African Union. I don't know if I should time it some sort of a fiery letter. Can you perhaps tell our viewers in a nutshell what was Transparency International's message in that letter to the African Union?
Thank you very much, Yusuf. The chapters of Transparency International in Africa met recently and decided to address a letter to the African Union, basically first appreciating the fact that, the African continent has set aside the 11th of July as the African Day Against Corruption, but also the year 2018 with a theme, winning the fight against corruption, a sustainable path to Africa's transformation.
Yes.
But while this has been done, we were pretty apprehensive that more needs to be done so that these gestures are meaningful. And we did isolate a few things we felt that needed attention from the leadership of the African Union and the governments of Africa. And it's basically the first one being that we need to strengthen the anti-corruption framework within the AU. Currently, we have a protocol, the African Protocol on Prevention and Combating Corruption, that was concluded in 2003. We actually noted that out of the countries of Africa, 55 of them, there are about 17 that are yet to ratify that convention. We also noted that the mechanism for monitoring that convention is quite weak. It's the African Union and Advisory Board Against Corruption that is based in Arusha. And these boards has members that are elected and serve on a 2-year term, which we felt was too short and needed to be extended. And they also serve pretty much on a voluntary basis, which might mean that they may not have the time to devote to the fight against corruption in the continent. But we also isolated other issues that we felt needed attention. If this year is going to be meaningful to the African people, we need to address their basic needs, how corruption affects their basic needs, like education. And we singled out education because it's really an equalizer when it comes to the needs of the people of this continent. But we isolated, are stemmed and stopped.
Yes, Samuel, and I'm seeing some of the figures that have been, thrown around, that Africa loses more than $90 billion every year through corruption. There is a very disturbing figure there. Now, let me bring Professor Alfred Omenya into this conversation. Now, Prof, this is not the first time that we've seen corruption being, the top agenda at the African Union Summit. The question is, why are we not seeing results?
Yes, as Kimeu has observed, there's quite a lot of resources lost in the continent, and the continent should have already started tackling this as a matter of urgency. If you're looking at $1 billion in terms of money held illegally outside of the continent. You are looking at slightly more than 10 times development aid that comes to Africa. So on one hand, Africa is begging, and on the other hand, money is actually being lost through corrupt means. Why aren't we seeing any results? I think in Africa we are focusing on the wrong things. I think we need to look at corruption fundamentally for what it is, as a governance issue, as a governance problem. Currently, corruption is being looked at largely as basically an institutional issue, which is okay. But the issue is not so much the institutions that have been put in place to fight corruption. The issue is that every single government in the continent should take direct responsibility. Political responsibility,
yes,
but also direct responsibility for all the corruption that happens in those countries. Because
Prof, I'm sure you'll agree with me that we are yet to see that. Now,
right.
Speaking about governance issue, let me bring Dr. Boniface, who's a governance expert, to this. Now, Dr. I've had Prof's point of view there. It's also corruption is governance, issues there he has talked about. Can you perhaps demystify this for us? Because if you talk to any African leader, they'll tell you that corruption is a global problem. But as much as it's a global problem, it's very much an African problem as well, right?
Thank you, Yusuf. Thank you, viewers. Let me start by saying that the day of African Anti-Corruption Day, this year was a second in terms of commemoration. The first commemoration was last year, that is 2017. Back to your question is that sometimes corruption more or less is viewed in different ways, but simply corruption is a theft of public resources. We seem to more or less take corruption and disassociate it from the public and see it more or less as simply misappropriation of funds, but in simple terms, corruption is a theft of public resources. Back to your question in terms of issues of governance and more or less the blame game and trying to shift the blame more or less elsewhere. One of the challenges facing AU is in terms of the way it runs its programs. AU and its programs, including the fight against corruption or anti-corruption fight, is that most of these programs, including the fight against corruption, is that they are funded by donors. So in terms of that political commitment, we should also be accompanied by funding of the program, is that it's not there. So it is left more or less to be funded by donors, and more so the commitment by the heads of state in terms of ensuring that if it's issues to do with implementing the convention, which Mr. Kimeu has talked about, you'll find that most of the states in Africa are lagging behind in terms of putting the provisions and implementing them and owning them, not waiting more or less for donors to inject funds in terms of running the programs. That has been a main weakness in terms of the ownership of fight against corruption.
Well said. Well said, Dr. Ali. Yes. Hold on to that. We're going to go to solutions shortly. But let me bring Samuel Kimeu back into this conversation. Let me take you back to the Transparency International report. Apparently, 90% of the population in Africa no longer report corruption. I mean, does this mean that corruption has been normalized in this continent, or basically people have given up on the own graft?
Well, I think basically what that means is that there are many Africans who feel that reporting corruption does not make a difference. And I think it speaks to the quality of our law enforcement institutions, particularly, because if you were to relate this to happenings here in Kenya, we would recall in 2003, when we had a change of government, citizens of this country went ahead to arrest people who are policemen in the streets who are engaging in corruption. But they stopped soon thereafter, especially after Anglo-leasing came to light and the realization that it was still business as usual. So if we are to have institutions that are strong and are able to deliver, then I think the levels of reporting corruption will go high, will go much higher. In the region, for example, Rwanda has a higher reporting rate than the rest of East Africa. The rest of East Africa has a rate that is similar to Kenya. Rwanda distinguishes itself because the system pretty much works. So if you report, you know that something going to be done about it.
The lifestyle audit, that all public service officials should undergo lifestyle audit, but this is a matter that has been widely politicized. Do you think there's a very thin line between, politics in a country like Kenya, for example? I'm just using Kenya as an example. The war on graft and politics. It seems there's a very thin line between these two.
Yes, that is true, and it does make sense because a lot of corruption and corruption-related issues revolve around politics and politicians. Those who are governing, those who are in charge of our institutions, those running the national government and the county government are politicians. They're the ones in charge of the resources within the country. What we expect in terms of good quality governance is that they will put systems, structures, administrative procedures that make it impossible to steal from the public. But what do we see? We see the exact opposite. We see a situation where theft is actually happening under their watch, and as such, it becomes very difficult for other agencies that are operating outside of this, like the Kenya Anti-Corruption Commission and the Public Prosecution Directorate, to be able to be effective. So when one politician, one leader like Uhuru Kenyatta comes in and says that we are going to do something about corruption, we shall have lifestyle audits, we shall have open procurement, the natural reaction of magicians
international, it comes up with findings, but in terms of the action taken by the government, in terms of putting measures in place and putting maybe on the spot those who are involved in corruption, we are seeing that there isn't more or less a proper reporting mechanism in terms of what is happening in terms of fight against corruption. So you find that the public is more or less kind of taking corruption to be a way of life, and also giving up in terms of maybe whether this fight against corruption is going to yield any fruits. So that kind of public acceptance in a way whereby corruption more or less is being seen that is a way of life, and more so is not more or less theft as such. Because let me go back to the earlier discussion which a professor had in terms of corruption and issues to do with the politics. Sometimes we are expecting too much when it comes to politicians, because if they get into those top seats on using corrupt means, and then at the same time, we want them to fight or support the fight against corruption and subject themselves to auditing. We are expecting too much because during campaign season, we are seeing these politicians are using a lot of resources. And again, we are aware that these resources normally come from some sources, or rather, they come from individuals who also are targeting more or less to engage in procurement, whether in counties or even in the national government. So there is need also to look at in terms of campaign financing and try to ensure that when it comes to structures to limit the amount of money used in campaigns, and also to audit who is supporting these politicians in their campaigns. Because if maybe politicians more or less assume office, and then we don't look at in terms of how did they get into the office in the first place, and then we demand upon them to be more or less in the forefront against, more or less in fight against corruption. I tend to believe that that is more or less expecting too much, and that's the reason whereby you see when it comes to the public is getting tired in terms of when they see these politicians more or less accepting finances maybe from some individuals who have some background which is known, and then they're using these resources for campaigns, and then at the same time, we expect these politicians to support the fight against corruption. Then, of course, that is
so we're expecting too much from them. Well said, Daktari. Let me, Daktari,
we don't need to audit them when they're in office. We need to start auditing them even during campaigns, so that we can be able to trace their sources of financing. Some of them, their background is known. So when we see them splashing a lot of money, the question is, Where are they getting all this money?
And I think
So,
that is why
terms of
lifestyle
reporting,
audit need to be
more is trying to
implemented there. Thanks,
ascertain.
Daktari, for that. Let me get Samuel once again, and let me take you back to the corruption perception index once again. I've already mentioned that most African countries have been dismally ranked, but still we're seeing some African countries which were basically doing well, the likes of Botswana, Seychelles, and Rwanda. The question is, what are they doing right, and why is it so difficult for the rest of the continent to follow suit?
Thanks, Yusuf. I think for countries that have performed quite well on the index, and in the fight against corruption generally, Rwanda, Botswana, Mauritius, Cape Verde, these are countries where the systems relatively work, so that if you encounter a crime and you report it, there are much higher chances in any of these countries that that matter is going to be investigated and resolved within a reasonable time compared to, say, what would happen in Kenya. So the systems work. So government and the systems of government do work. When that happens, the efficiency of government helps citizens to gain more confidence in their government, to come forward and report cases, to also take part actively in helping the institutions of government to realize the objectives and the aspirations of the people generally. I think that is the difference that it makes. And it starts mainly from the leadership and the politics, the political environment that obtains in those countries. If it's an environment that supports accountability, every institution, including the private sector, whether it is indigenous private sector or external private sector coming to invest in a country, will be forced to abide by the laws of the land and to help the people, get to their aspirations, because that is the tenure and the tone that has been set politically and also by the leadership of that country.
Well said, Samuel. As we conclude this discussion, let me give Professor Alfred the last word here. Now, Prof, we've heard about solutions on how to fight graft. It's always on paper, but with that the implementation bit of it is always different. Alfred is a policy analyst. Samuel Kimeo is the Executive Director, Transparency International Kenya. And earlier, we did ask you this question. What do you envision as your individual role in ending the cycle of corruption in Africa? Let me go through some of the feedback here. Misheka Enoch says, teaching the young vices of honesty, hard work, and integrity to build a generation free from corruption. Also, by being a good